Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. And hi, Salish Uncle. Thanks for the invitation for this presentation. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Tushar Mehta. I'm a physician from the Toronto, Canada area, and I work emergency medicine. And I'm also myself personally vegan, and I do a lot of education regarding the science about plant-based diet or vegan diet and the implications for health. So how to do it in the most healthy way and what are the health benefits if we do it in the most healthy way, as well as environmental impact. I have a website called Plant-Based Data, which I'll show in a second. So today, let me just go. I have a few slides, but then I'm going to talk, and I'm not just going to only do slides today, okay? Because let's see, okay, here we go. And first of all, I should share screen and go to this over here. Okay. And can you all see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay. Now I'm going to leave the slides in the corner. Can you see my cursor moving around as well?
Yep.
Yeah, you can? Okay, great. So Salish Uncle asked me to present about the myth of regenerative grazing. Okay, so has everybody heard? I think many of you have heard of this whole idea that people can graze cattle and that grazing cattle naturally, if done right, if done correctly, will store carbon in the soil, in grasslands, and continue to sort of draw down carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the soil. And therefore, you can have animal meat or animal products from these cattle that are low carbon, carbon neutral, or even negative carbon, that the cattle itself is negative carbon because the grazing process, which they portray as natural, is storing carbon in the ground, right? I think that everybody must have heard that. And this right now is a big push by the meat and dairy industry, okay? That's their sort of major marketing push right now to tell this kind of a story about animal products, especially about beef. That's a little bit about me. So I'm a physician from Toronto, and you can also see my presentation online, which is a general presentation about the environmental impact of animal agriculture. So if you Google "the earth is on fire, animal agriculture and the global environmental impact," or just "animal agriculture, global environmental impact," or "earth is on fire," whatever, and my name, Tushar Mehta, if you put any of those terms together plus my name in Google, you'll find my presentation online on YouTube. And I give a talk that sort of spans the general evidence about the impact of animal agriculture on the planet. I also have a website that I hope you'll take note of. It's called Plant-Based Data, okay? So here I have an online database. We have a small team with an online database that is compiling the best research from journals as well as institutions like the United Nations and WWF and so forth about animal agriculture and health, zoonoses, environment, etc. So it's meant to be a resource for other organizations, whatever organization you may be part of. We can help supply the information that you need. And A Well-Fed World is an organization. I'm on the board of directors of that organization. And again, it's an organization that talks about how we can provide better food security and decrease environmental impact, and also better eco-justice and food justice through plant-based foods, which take less resources and can feed more people at the same time. So right now, we're kind of in this post-truth era. I think we all know that, where people can say anything, and financially motivated people can say anything that suits their needs and convince everybody that it's true. The fossil fuel industry does this. The smoking industry sort of were the progenitors of this misinformation in the modern age. And now the meat industry is doing the same thing. You have this guy, Alan Savory, who's kind of the poster child of the animal agriculture industry. Yeah, and then you have these movies coming out and books coming out like Sacred Cow and Kiss the Ground. Sounds so beautiful, and they talk about these breakthroughs that, you know, oh, we're just going to breed cattle and graze cattle in this new way, and it's going to solve all of our climate problems. And their main claims are that you do this so-called regenerative grazing, and it's better than the sort of conventional grazing people do. and it restores the soil and restores biodiversity, reverses climate change, and can feed the world and provide better nutrition. And the way they say that they do this is that you have your cattle, and instead of just having your cattle in one place all the time, you sort of have them and you move them through different sections of your land. So they eat a little bit, poo a little bit, and then they go to the next section, and they don't completely eat all of the vegetation from the ground to cause, strip the ground bare, but they eat just enough and poop just enough and then move on. And that this somehow mimics the pattern that natural animals like buffalo used to do on the land. And they make many other claims too, but that's kind of the basic thing. They completely ignore the reality of what's going on, and that is that we're burning down forests and causing mass deforestation in order to graze more cattle and feed more cattle in order to provide higher amounts of meat. Now, to understand this whole process and why they are wrong and why they're just telling these sort of nice sounding stories, you have to understand a few baseline things about what's going on the planet. If you look 10,000 years prior to the current time, humans were just one species amongst thousands and thousands of other animal species, and we made up just far less than 1% of the biomass, of the mass of all vertebrate animals. So we're not talking about like worms and insects, but vertebrates, those with a spine on the land. We're talking about land-based vertebrates, and we made up less than 1% of the mass. But fast forward to the current times, we've wiped out a large proportion of the actual wild animals. And humans make up about 1/3 of the biomass because our population has swelled to nearly 8 billion currently. And our livestock means our chickens, goats, pigs, cattle. If you put them all on the scale, they make up about 2/3 of the biomass of the world. And wild animals make up, depending on which studies you look at, about 1 to 4% of the remaining vertebrate biomass. And that's incredible. If you just look at chickens on Earth alone, that one species, which is actually created by humans, it's bred by humans from natural animals, but never existed before naturally. That one species, and a few subtypes of chickens, of course there are, outweigh all wild bird species by 3 times. If you put 15 to 20,000 of the wild bird species on a scale, the number sort of is 15 to 20K because of just how you define a species. If you put all wild birds on a scale against chickens, chickens will outweigh all of them by 3 times. And that just shows you the scale of how we're changing the Earth and controlling life on Earth. And if you look at WWF data and Royal Society of London, Zoological Society, that between 1970 and actually if you go to 2016 now, the human population has doubled. This is 2014 data, but slightly older slide. But the animal population has actually declined by 68%. That's the wild animal population, the numbers of animals. So it's kind of insanity. And as I mentioned, the world population has increased so much. By 2050, we'll be 10 billion. By the end of the century, we're going to be 12 to 15 billion people. And we have to feed everyone. And that's just at a growth rate, depending on just, about 1% will lead to this. And a slight variation in the percentage will lead to those variable numbers by the end of the century. In terms of livestock, just land livestock, not including fish, we slaughter about 70 to 80 billion land animals per year. That's over 2,000 animals per second, okay? Monogastric animals like chickens, pigs, and other poultry, birds, right? They eat grain, soy, oil seeds, and so forth. That's how they're fed. And ruminants, which are cattle, goats, buffalo, they graze or they eat the similar feed as the monogastric animals do, grain, soy, oil seeds, and those kind of things as well. So but because they ruminate, they create a lot of methane by the digestion process, which is mostly burped out. It comes up out of their esophagus and will burp out of their mouth, and a small amount through the back end as well, right? Okay, and that's methane. We have been changing the earth. 75% of the land-based environment is altered by humans. 2/3 of the marine environment is significantly altered. We're using up most of the fresh water for our livestock and crop use, and our deforestation by is increased, and 300% increase in crop production since 1970. In terms of everything green that grows on Earth, humans have deforested half the Earth so far. And we're set by the end of the century to deforest about 90% at current rates of deforestation. And humans control a quarter of everything that now grows on the Earth through the sunlight. And that's through our agriculture. And we're also, deforesting more trees for use for all the wood that we're using. Okay. Now, out of all the land that we said we're using 75% of the Earth's land. 50% of the Earth's land is actually agriculture. Okay. So of all the land we use, most of it is for agriculture. And most of that is for animal agriculture. 30 to 40% of the Earth's land is used for animal agriculture. And that includes, 10 to 15% of the Earth's land is used for growing crops, but half of that is fed to animals. So it's only about 6-7% of the Earth's surface that actually grows food that directly feeds directly feeds humans. But that small proportion of the Earth's land that is used to directly feed humans provides us with more than 60% of our protein. And so it shows how efficient we are at growing plants to feed humans compared to animals. With a small land footprint, we can grow enough crops and to feed 60% of the world's protein needs. Okay, and what we're encountering here is this kind of ecological genocide through all human activities, and animal agriculture plays a big role in that. Okay, now I'm going to quickly talk about a feed conversion ratio. That means if an animal eats food, not all of that food is converted to protein in that animal's body. Like if a chicken eats, the chicken will have to eat 3 to 6 kilograms of plant protein to just make up 1 kilogram of protein that people will eat in that chicken's flesh. Okay, so that's a loss. That's not efficient. You're losing 2/3 or more of that protein. And it's different for different animals, but it's least efficient for cattle and ruminants, so goats, sheep, and cattle. You're talking about 10 to 18 kilograms of protein consumed to 1 kilogram protein provided back that somebody may consume. And it could be even less than that if the efficiency is less. And you can see farmed fish and insects, even if you get the most efficient, these numbers are sort of the most efficient numbers you can get from animals. It can always be worse than this. Then you're not doing much better. Okay, you're sort of plateaued at that level of 3 to 1 efficiency for protein. And it's even worse for calories. So basically, to feed animals and then feed them to humans, you're going to take more land, more water, more soil, more pesticides, more of everything to get to this, into a set amount of food. Okay. And there's a great website called Our World in Data that shows this in a nice graph showing you sort of all the land, the usable land in the world. Okay, the rest is ocean. If you just look at all the land and then all the usable land, how much of that is used for animal agriculture and how much of that is just remains as sort of natural land, and what a small percentage of the Earth, of the world's protein it provides compared to plant-based agriculture. Okay, and then that's why animal agriculture is driving deforestation, rainforest loss, wetland loss, grassland alteration, biodiversity loss in general. It's like the biggest factor. Okay, that doesn't mean that other things aren't factors too. It doesn't mean that if you're vegan, we can fly around on our private jet, or have huge homes, or drive big cars. No, that doesn't excuse us from that, but it just shows that overall animal agriculture is a factor as big as all of these. And if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein, then you can see that cattle, and ruminants, these top bars over here, create the most greenhouse gas emissions compared to other meats and dairy and everything like that. But look at down here, the plant-based agriculture, the pulses, so beans, lentils, peas, nuts, soy, they create so few greenhouse gas emissions in comparison, but also use much, much, much less land. These are charts from Our World in Data, and it just shows you breakdown of how the source of these greenhouse gases and the range of greenhouse gases. So if you optimize beef production, so beef at the top causes the most greenhouse gas emissions. It can be very extreme at the very end over here. But if done really, really well and in the perfect scenario, you can have some people who cause much less emissions. So that's still a lot of emissions if you're here compared to plant-based agriculture, which is here, okay, which is just very slight emissions or even negative emissions, because you can actually get plant-based foods that at least for a few years can help store carbon in the ground, can actually really help store carbon in the ground. But at least you can vary the carbon impact of grazing animals or animal production by improving or worsening your practices, okay? So it shows that there are some variations. So if done optimally, if done right, if we use all the best techniques, you can get a lower amount of emissions, but not nearly as low as what the animal agriculture people say that you can get. And just looking at land again, this is all the land in the continental United States that is used for grazing compared to livestock feed. But grazing provides a very small amount of the total animal protein that people are consuming. Now, we have myself and my partner in the Plant-Based Data Project recently wrote a paper that criticizes or analyzes, you can say, a paper that came out from the animal agriculture industry. There's a farm called White Oaks Pasture, and General Mills, this giant company, buys some of their meat from White Oaks Pasture. And then these guys did a study, their own sort of funded study, saying that how great they're doing and how they're storing, potentially storing carbon in the ground and all these kind of things. But we sort of take that apart and analyze it. So you're welcome to go there and just look up plant-based data, it's actually another attempt to greenwash beef, and you'll find our article. Now I'm going to take off my screen sharing right now. And I'm just going to talk about this whole concept of regenerative grazing and what the industry is kind of doing there. Now, as I mentioned, they make these claims where they're saying that, hang on, let me see if I can find you all again. And I'm just going to change something on my screen. There we go. Okay, good. So now they're saying that, okay, if we graze animals differently, we can restore, store carbon in the soil and reverse climate change. That's kind of their basic premise, right, that they're saying, okay? Now, let's look at just a few facts about what's really going on. As I mentioned, grazing takes up a huge amount of land, but it provides only, if you look at grazing globally, it takes up about 25 to 30% of the Earth's surface, but provides only 1.2% of the world's protein because it is so extremely inefficient. Now, it may be important for some subpopulations. There may be some populations who live in sort of poor villages, etc., that's their only source or one of their few sources of food. So it may be important for those people, but for the majority of humans, we have access to plant-based proteins that can be much more efficient and grow for us. So in terms of the soil science, it is very complicated, and soil does store carbon in various ways. What the animal agriculture guys say is that you need cattle there to cause the soil to store carbon. But that's actually not true. What the real factor is in storing carbon in the ground is that you have plants. Plants grow, they do photosynthesis, they're taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at all times and absorbing it, and it becomes part of their plant matter. And part of the plant is underground, of course, and part of it is above ground. And basically it continually is drawing carbon into its plant body. And as the plant sort of cycles or dies or whatever, part of the carbon from the plant is stored in the ground and part of it is above the ground. And even the above ground carbon eventually will break down and part of it will go into the soil and become part of the soil as well in various ways. Okay, and it's a complicated process. I've simplified it a lot. Now, what these animal agriculture guys are saying is that you require cattle and their poop to do this, but it isn't true. Really, all you need is you need to just fully allow plants to grow on the ground, on the Earth's surface, and they're going to do fine just on their own without cattle being there. Okay, there's an excellent paper about this from the Food Climate Research Network, which is now called Table, called Grazed and Confused, and I highly recommend that that paper for anyone to read if you want to learn more about it. Okay, but these guys do various things. First of all, let's go through some of the things that they say. First of all, they say they look at different research, which concludes that carbon is stored in the ground from their better practices of grazing, whether they call it regenerative grazing or holistic grazing or multi-paddock grazing. It's all kind of the same thing. And really what it is that those studies, all they do is they compare the improved grazing techniques to conventional grazing techniques. So yes, it is better than conventional grazing, but that doesn't mean that it's better than just rewilding the land or growing plant-based foods in an optimal fashion. Okay, so that's one of the things that they do to kind of trick the numbers. All right, and they also say that, okay, if we're storing carbon in the ground, that we can do that indefinitely. We can keep storing carbon in the ground, but that's also not true. If they're using optimal grazing techniques, the carbon in the ground that they'll store just sort of goes up to a certain point where it gets saturated, but it won't reach the point where if you would reforest the land itself. They, when we look at the factors that improve grazing, one of the main things is to use less cattle. If you have too many cattle, it sort of strips the ground bare and causes a release of carbon from the soil, and instead of storing more carbon in the soil. And also lets soil erosion happen and causes a lot of damage to the soil itself. So if they want to improve their grazing techniques, it really means that they have to raise less animals on each piece of land. So that means per unit of beef production, they're going to actually use more and more land to do that. In which case people actually have to either eat less animals, or if they want to eat the same amount of animals, they're going to end up causing more deforestation as the grazing land expands over other areas. Okay, so that's one of the things that they overlook or kind of hide in their presentation of so-called regenerative grazing. Okay, they say that grazing cattle replaces the role of indigenous animals that used to do grazing. So in North America, there were buffalo that roamed over many parts of the land, and those were all wiped out by Europeans, who then wiped them out, partly to wipe out all the Aboriginal people, to, you know, it was kind of a colonial practice, and then replaced all of these buffalo, which were natural, by cattle, with cattle. And they say that, well, now cattle will just do the things that buffalo used to do in the ecosystem, but that's not true. Cattle versus buffalo, the buffalo's migration patterns, their grazing patterns, and everything that they did was very different than what these cattle, which are human creations. Again, there's no such thing as natural cows. Cows are bred by humans from a natural animal, which is now extinct. Cows are a form of human technology, really. They do not replace the role of natural animals. And also they're, you know, breeding them and raising them in areas where there were no buffalo as well. So the argument doesn't even make sense in those kind of areas. And, you know, these guys say that trampling the ground by hooves is beneficial, but again, it doesn't mimic what really happened with buffalo. And in most cases, trampling the ground by large numbers of cattle is not going to be beneficial to the soil. Will cause compaction, will cause erosion, and trample many other species that should be growing naturally. Okay. they consider manure as being magical. They're saying that the soil will not store carbon and plants are not going to grow optimally unless you have animals that are, these cattle that are pooping everywhere, and their poop will give a lot of benefit. But in reality, their poop causes extra methane and nitrous oxide emissions, which are climate change gases. Okay, they're greenhouse gases. And at the same time, many cases runs off into water systems and causes pollution in those water systems, like eutrophication and bacterial contamination as well. That happens if they poop on the ground and the bacteria and nutrients go deep into the ground, into groundwater, or they wash into rivers and streams. Even if you didn't have the animal manure, if you just left land alone, rewilding and plants grow really well on their own. Okay, they never address the fundamental inefficiency issue about how much land resources it takes to grow a certain amount of protein, a small amount of protein. And they sort of say that, oh, we can just grow lots of food and feed the world, but they're not doing the math whatsoever when they look at the big picture, okay? And really what happens is that the opposite is true, where you're using more land to create less food and then feeding it to the most wealthy people in most cases. Although there are some subsistence agriculturalists, they are a minority of the people who are actually consuming these animal foods. And they present kind of this bad interpretation of plant agriculture. They show these really beautiful pictures of a few cows on this large field, right? Which is really not going to feed a lot of people. And that's not really what most grazing operations look like. And it's certainly not scalable to feed many people. But they show this picture, which looks really, really nice. And then they show plant agriculture, and they just show that these sort of row cropping, industrialized plant agriculture with lots of pesticides and lots of chemicals. And certainly there's a lot of plant-based agriculture that is not done well, but there are very good ways of improving our plant-based agriculture so that even our plant-based agriculture, our vegan foods, et cetera, can be grown in a much more sustainable way than many of them are currently grown. Okay, we can increase the proportion of organic foods. We can use low-till or no-till agriculture, because tilling the soil causes erosion and soil damage and releases carbon into the atmosphere as well, so it damages the soil. So we would like to replace our tillage practices, okay? And there are many other things that we could do, like intercropping and mixed use cropping and so forth, instead of monocropping, that in many cases, certain types of plants like lentils and legumes and soy fertilize with nitrogen the adjacent plants or the sequential plants like grains or fruits or vegetables or whatever. So intercropping and all these kind of things can be done. And there's very, very good practices of conservation agriculture, which if you look at our paper, the one that I mentioned, the analysis of this white oaks pasture study, then in that paper, we have really good links to sources about conservation agriculture for plant-based agriculture. The other thing that these guys who promote regenerative grazing, or so-called regenerative grazing, is the fact that, okay, well, if you switch to plant-based agriculture, you can grow your same amount of food that you may be using this much land for. Now you can just use this small amount of land to grow the same amount of protein and calories. You can just reduce your land use so much to a much smaller amount, and therefore all the extra land that you were using for animal agriculture can be rewilded. You can just allow forests or wetlands or grasslands to become natural again, okay? Because even when they are grazing animals on grasslands, they say that this is natural, but actually it's not natural. If you remove the cattle and allow all the natural animals to come back, including predators, which people who are grazing, they will always kill off all the predators, which will threaten their livestock, then you'll have a much better grassland ecosystem that is more natural, stores more carbon, more biodiversity, et cetera. So basically, switching to plant-based agriculture, using conservation agriculture techniques, using a much smaller amount of land, and allowing the rest of the land to become rewilded is the best case scenario for nature and for growing the food that we need on more securely, because we don't, we have to feed more people as the Earth's population grows. We can grow that food on a much smaller parcel of land. Okay. They do other things like calculate methane in a different manner so that the math or the numbers look better for methane. And methane is their main greenhouse gas from cattle agriculture. So they're trying to sort of lowball the numbers. And again, as I mentioned, they try to say that pastures, their cattle pastures where they raise animals are natural, but in most cases they have replaced a natural, or in all cases they've replaced a natural ecosystem, a truly natural ecosystem, and indeed they are the biggest cause of deforestation, because you have to cut down the forest to create the pasture, you have to drain the wetland to create the pasture, or you have to change a natural grassland as you graze cattle on that land to optimize your grazing. Okay. Okay. So, and in many cases, these grasslands that they're using, they fertilize them, they irrigate them, they divert water sources to irrigate them as well. So they're not quite as natural as you think. And the worst forms of grazing actually cause desertification and the total stripping of all vegetation from the land. Now, that also includes other human activities that contribute to this, but grazing is one of the biggest causes of desertification. You'll never find them talking about that or discussing that in any of their movies or papers or anything like that. You'll never find them talking about how cattle are burning down the Amazon, not there, but humans are burning down the Amazon in order to raise animals there, grow their feed or graze them. But they also say that these marginal lands, which are very sensitive to desertification, the only thing that poor people can do there is graze cattle or ruminants. So you're not going to have plant-based foods for people to eat there. Well, number one, this is representing only a very small proportion of people on the earth, okay? But they're very important because they're part of the global poor. But it's not true that you can't grow anything there. There are different types of legumes and pulses and hemp and things like that that can actually grow very well on these marginal lands. So it's a question of adapting and teaching people, or bringing back some of the crops that even they used to grow but no longer grow because maybe the cattle ranchers were stronger than the farmers, and their cattle went and sort of took over the land where people were actually growing crops traditionally on marginal lands. All right, so there's an aggressive sort of promotion of this idea of regenerative grazing. They paint a beautiful picture. They have movies and books and speakers, but they're not going through the data very well. And they always present themselves as like, we're these small farmers, family farmers, etc. But indeed, actually, all of these little guys that they present in their papers or on their movies are funded and are the suppliers for the big animal agriculture companies like JBS, Tyson, Cargill, and all those kind of people. And there's a big linkage. And when they bring out these movies, Kiss the Ground and Sacred Cow and the past year, the next thing you know, McDonald's is advertising their sustainable beef and all that kind of stuff. So it's just this larger industry strategy that tells this beautiful story, but most of it is not true, okay? And they also ignore the human rights factors when basically indigenous people are driven off their land over and over again in the Amazon in order to graze cattle and grow cattle feed and things like that. So those are some of the major problems with their story. And I hope you'll go to our paper to have a much more technical analysis of compared to what I've been saying right now, that has a lot of scientific references behind everything that I'm stating here, and take a look at that. And there's a lot of psychology here too. The big industries, what they do, like the smoking industry, when evidence came out that smoking was bad for people, they would create all kinds of ads and create a lot of their own research showing that cigarettes are not bad for you, they may even be good for you, and cause a lot of confusion. And it took decades for people to realize that smoking was actually bad for you, even though the science was there, because the industry was creating misinformation and confusion. That's exactly what the oil industry does to create, or the fossil fuel industry does to create doubt about climate change, and what the animal agriculture industry is doing to create doubt about plant-based foods and to just take their worst foods and promote them as the best foods through just telling a beautiful story. But nobody has, or very few people have the knowledge or the science or the time to look into the science and really distinguish which, what's true and what's not. And they're taking great advantage of that. Plus, they have the, the media and everything like that. They have literally millions and millions of dollars to spend on advertising. So, and they create all these sophisticated programs. But the conclusion is that regenerative grazing, the best grazing practice, yes, they can be somewhat better than the worst grazing practices. Okay, the better grazing practice can be better than the worst grazing practices, but they're not going to be better than the best of plant-based conservation agriculture, which uses far less land and causes much less carbon emissions and can feed a lot more people using much fewer resources. And that the saved land, because if we're using a lot less land, the saved land can actually be rewilded. And that's one of the most important things needed by the natural world everywhere on Earth, okay? And that's sort of the big take-home message there. And that especially our plant-based proteins, okay, our beans, lentils, whole grains, and so forth, they're gonna take a lot less land if we're feeding directly to humans. And that's the thing that we should really focus on and that people need to know, okay? So I hope you'll take a look at the paper there and share that around as well. And we'll continue discussing this to sort of debunk this major marketing strategy that has been very effective in sort of swaying people's minds everywhere. And it's a big problem. So that's why we're doing this work, to try and debunk what they're saying, right? I guess that's almost all my time, and I'm going to leave a little bit of time for questions as well here. So maybe Salish Uncle, you want to open it up if people have questions or comments at this point.
Certainly.
Hey, Dr. Tushar, great talk. I have a quick question. What's your recommendation regarding the new upcoming strain of the G4EA H1N1 and the H7N9? How can we address it, get the population to be aware of this, and also thereby reduce animal slaughter? Thanks.
So are you talking about these flu strains that are affecting chickens in different countries like the Netherlands, India, UK, etc., and that they're culling the chickens for those strains? Is that what you're specifically referring to?
Well, I'm not sure where they are, but the G4 Eurasian avian,
the avian influenza.
You're talking about in China.
Yeah, right.
It's found in the pigs in China. So.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I'll put it in the link here. There's a podcast I did about zoonotic disease that comes from animals. And as we breed animals, people are always breeding animals in these large sort of populations. We have these massive populations of livestock, which outnumber and outweigh the natural animals on the world, as I mentioned. They are always acquiring viruses, generating viruses, and become a biogenerator for new viruses and new mutations of these viruses at all times. So these new strains that we're talking about, that's not a new story. For decades, this process has been going on. For decades, we're always generating new forms of viruses through animal agriculture. And whenever we practice mass animal agriculture, we have higher number of virus generations and also higher number of exposures between humans and those viruses as well. So SARS-CoV-19, that definitely comes from a form of mass animal agriculture, this kind of bushmeat / wet market, wild animal trade that was happening in China, that's been happening in China for a long time. And it's on such a massive scale that we're generating mutations of viruses and exposing humans, and that's how we got COVID-19. Okay, that's how SARS 2002 happened as well. The swine flu comes from a combination of, that was in 2009, there was a girl in our emergency department, one of the emergency departments where I work, who died, a little girl, it's just 4 or 5 years old. And unfortunately her whole family had contracted this and she was a victim. And many people died around the world from that swine flu. That's through avian / strains that also mutated, were transmitted and mutated amongst pigs, and different mutations happening and then eventually infecting humans and causing this swine flu outbreak in humans. So I have a podcast about that. And then Dr. Michael Greger has a book about these zoonotic diseases, which is really excellent, as well as his own YouTube series about it as well on nutritionfacts.org. I encourage you to look at those things and share them around and show people that if we keep breeding animals in large numbers, we're also breeding and generating large numbers of viruses. And we are definitely going to cause future pandemics. Okay, it could be 5 years from now, it could be 15 years from now, or 25 years from now that the next pandemic will come. But when it comes, it can be much worse potentially than COVID-19. You can have 10 times the death rate. You know, it could be double the death rate. It could be 10 times the death rate, or even worse. And that's really going to rock the world and be COVID-19 will seem like a minor inconvenience compared to how bad a future pandemic can actually be. So this is very important as well. So from the health point of view, from the environmental point of view, climate, biodiversity, et cetera, but then also the zoonotic potential of animal agriculture is huge. These new avian influenzas are mostly right now amongst the chickens themselves and causing the death of large populations of chickens, and then people are sort of culling them and killing off these populations to prevent spread. It's terrible. But eventually you will get viruses that infect humans, and that happens every year in small numbers. But once in a while, you'll get one that really spreads and is more dangerous, and that will cause a future pandemic. I hope that helps.